Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Severe floods across Asia and Southeast Asia this month have displaced thousands and exposed the region's growing climate vulnerabilities. As floods become more frequent and more severe, are countries, including Malaysia, prepared for the consequences? Well, joining me on the show tonight to discuss this further is Steffi Uleman-Elmer, who is Director of Global Flood Solutions at Moody's. Steffi, thank you so much for joining me today. I came across Moody's new analysis, which maps how global flood risk has evolved over time and where it's headed in the future. I thought it was quite fascinating. And thank you so much for joining us. So maybe you can give us a bit of some insight into this report. What would you say, Steffi, is the single most important message that the world should really take note of from this report?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And glad to see that this report is actually getting read and spread across the world. So at Moody's, we are kind of like experts in flood risk management and flood risk modeling, because that is kind of like our bread and butter. And we have taken to analyze what does that mean for the entire globe, but then also breaking it down into individual regions. And if there's one main takeaway, and that may not come quite as a surprise, is flood risk is not a local or regional issue. It is really a global issue. It is a growing global challenge. We have become aware of so many flood events globally over the past couple of years, but also in the past, in the history. So there is precedence, but then there's overlay with exposure, with rapid growth in terms of population in flood risk, in risky areas, let's put it that way. And that is what the report basically exposes. It just does that analysis over time and then understands, okay, well, how have flood exposures changed as we see them?
Right. Could you maybe give us a little bit of insight? Because one of the things that I found most shocking was that over a period of time, the risk of flooding to populations here have grown about almost 100%, 95%, if I'm not mistaken. Is that accurate? Could you give us more insight?
Depends a bit on which period you're looking at. I mean, maybe just to set the baseline for today. So what we are seeing from the report, and if you consider a risk scenario of like 100-year flood, so that is kind of like a fairly severe scenario, if you want to take it. Nearly 1 in 3 people globally is exposed to flooding. So that is just a percentage assessment. And if you then break it further down, so 25 at this 100-year return period, 25% of the global population is exposed to inland flood, and that is already for when they are being protected by flood defenses, and 36% for coastal floods respectively. So there's a lot of successes in terms of like defenses. So it's not a like totally gloomy and doomy type of picture, but generally in terms of growth over time, yes, you see population growth and flood risk growth takes pace at the same amount. And unfortunately, though, still we see even more exposure growth on the flood risk side relative to what we see from just population. So that is probably the number that you're referring to.
Right. So let's zoom in on this region. So let's look at South Asia, Southeast Asia. Where does it sit in the global risk picture? If you could maybe specify some of the countries within these regions that Moody's identifies as most at risk today.
Yeah, so that is a bit the main outcome of the study as well. Probably also not surprising, but generally what we saw from the study, which is global, South and Southeast Asia are disproportionately affected by flooding relative to the rest of the world. So that in terms of numbers, what does that mean? Nearly 40% of Asia's population is susceptible to inland flooding. Again, at this 100-year return period, 5% to risk of coastal flooding, and both those figures are well above the global average. So if you take the global average, we would talk about 29% of the world's population at risk for inland and 3% for coastal. So that gives kind of like for the entire region the relativity. If you then break it further down into, okay, which of the Asian or Southeast Asian countries are most at risk, if you just take it by population, you end up with the most populous states in any case. So India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. But even if you do the percentage again, so really relative risk of that population to flood risk, you still see Bangladesh there, you still see Pakistan and Cambodia. And that is for the inland portion. If you go and swap over to the more coastal risk, so anything from storm surge, etc., you do see pretty much the same picture. Bangladesh, China, India are, from an absolute perspective, obviously most exposed. And if you then flip it again into the relative risk, then you see all of the oceanic island states, which is not a surprise, right? But the study just confirms that.
Right. And what about Malaysia, Steffi? In Malaysia's case, how would Moody's characterize our exposure, both to inland and coastal flooding?
Yeah, so Malaysia is pretty much in the same mix as the entire Southeast Asia region. Again, above the average exposure compared to global averages. In terms of population at risk, you are sort of like at a 46% of the population does have some risk of flooding, both on the inland side and on the coastal side. So that is quite severe. I think what the good point about Malaysia is there's a fairly it's a high level to start with, so let's not be fooled by that. But there's a fairly stable growth here over time. It's not as if there's kind of like an acceleration that we're seeing right now. There's still growth and there's still a lot to do, but it's not kind of like accelerating as much as in other states.
And based on that, what do we see as the implications? So we have this picture of global risk, but when we think about the economic losses that come from that, what is it that Moody's is anticipating if current trends continue? Let's take a look at maybe the Southeast Asia region and for Malaysia specifically.
So pretty much, as I said, for Malaysia and also for the Southeast Asia region, yes, we still see growing trends, but they are multifaceted. So there's many reasons to those trends. Population growth is the one thing. Where does population grow is the other thing. So still more growth in exposed areas that are at risk of flooding as opposed to other areas. General trends of urbanization are underpinning that, and then there's also some mixed signals depending on how you look at that, from urban areas to rural areas. So there's been a lot of investment, for example, in the Smart Tunnel in Kuala Lumpur. So that takes away some of that risk, right? But then you see other regions where there is less of an investment in risk mitigation, and then there's an acceleration, obviously. So from an economic perspective, yes, losses are likely to continue to rise, also on an annual average level. What is interesting and very important to consider for the region, it is a economic region, right? Southeast Asia, the ASEAN 5. That is what you also need to consider. And what I find very interesting, because outside of that global study, we also look at the correlated risk within that region. We have a correlated model for it. And what you see in terms of like the tail scenarios, that is where multiple countries get affected. Same as what we just recently saw, right? In the December flooding, it is Thailand, it is Indonesia, it is Malaysia, all at the same time, because they basically have the same climatology. And then if you have a tropical cyclone, that will not restrict itself to just one particular country. It will cross the divides. And that is where, from an economic perspective, you quite quickly get into all of those questions that we saw in Thailand 2011, right? Supply chain, the global supply chain disruptions, right? And that is economically quite damaging. And not just for one country, but for the entirety of the region.
Yeah, it's all interconnected. So if there was something that governments can do, you mentioned a bit earlier that you touched on existing kind of flood defenses and how well defended some populations are in terms of level of exposure. So if there was maybe an urgent policy for governments in this region to make now to avoid losses in the future, to avoid any impact, economic and social, what would it be? What would Moody's recommend governments prioritize?
Shifting from post-disaster cleanup to a pre-disaster action. I think that is the main call to make. And I know there has been a lot of investment. I really truly want to call out how Malaysia has also championed some of those initiatives, but there's a lot to do. And that is certainly, how you translate it into policy. There's a lot of options to navigate. What we see globally, what is successful is public-private partnerships. Also, there's one element which is how do you protect your population? And then there's the other element, and I think that is even more important to consider because it has this back effect to population protection. How do you protect the financial well-being of your people? How do you increase that insurance take-up rate that does that financial protection? And that is preemptive action, right? This is not kind of like waiting for this disaster to happen and then spend a lot of money for those people who would otherwise be totally at risk. It's a humanitarian crisis at that point, right? So there's a lot which can be done, and I think there's a lot of good examples in the world that may actually inform that policy shift.
Any examples that come to mind now?
I mean, if you look at across the world, right, I mean, there are certain schemes where you have reinsurance backbones installed in the country because that in the end then alleviates a bit the pain of like the premium, which is the most important hurdle for low income classes to purchase insurance, right? How do you make that accessible and available and affordable? So there's a whole chain from the primary policy holder to all the way how it then transacts into reinsurance, and that is the backup, essentially the financial backup. If you get this sorted, then many of the things probably will actually follow.
Steffi, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Steffi Ulaman-Elmer there from Moody's. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's continue our conversation about the severe floods that's happening across much of South Asia and Southeast Asia this month, which have killed more than 1,750 people in Asia and displaced thousands more. Joining me to discuss the gravity of the situation is Anissa M. Ismail, who is the Regional Migration and Displacement Senior Officer at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC. Anissa, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. There was a great new report by the IFRC titled Forced to Flee in a changing climate, and some of the findings in there highlighted things that I was really surprised to learn. I would ask you maybe to share with us what you think are the most critical findings from that report and what it tells you about how climate change is really shaping displacement and migration patterns within this region.
The report is published in August this year, and this is actually the first time IFRC has produced a climate report focused specifically on displacement. It is a crucial milestone because for the first time, we have a consolidated picture of how climate impacts are driving people across Asia Pacific to move. And having this data matters because it helps Red Cross and Red Crescent National Society and also important stakeholders such as the government to understand which communities are most affected, how often families are being displaced, and what kind of support do they need before, during, and after disaster. And although the report showcases the extensive of the activities that have been done and implemented by the Red Cross and Red Crescent National Societies across Asia Pacific, but usually there are more that can be done, right? There's more that can be strengthened. So the report is actually compiles the evidence and data to allow us to plan better and to strengthen areas that we have identified, such as the early warning and preparedness system, so that fewer families are forced to flee, more resilient, and can recover sustainably. So
Right.
in short, this report fills a critical gap. It can guide action and help protect millions of or more people in the years ahead. But coming back to your question about the critical findings of the report, there are several critical findings actually that we have identified in the report, but I will point it out and highlight three findings that I will share with you today. So the first one is regarding scale. In 2024 alone, in Asia Pacific, we observe about 24 million disaster displacement across Asia Pacific. And this figure actually accounted for more than half of all disaster displacement in worldwide. So to give you a further perspective on this, within even Asia Pacific region itself, there are 5 countries that are accounted for 91% of all disaster displacement. So the Philippines alone saw more about 9 million disaster displacement, and this follows by China, India, and then afterward Bangladesh and Afghanistan. This shows that a concentrated small number of countries actually share the burden of the climate impact in our region. This means that nearly all climate-related displacement in Asia Pacific is happening in a country whereby that country are being hit again and again.
Right.
That's the first one regarding the scale. And in relation to this, secondly, the report also shows displacement is becoming more frequent. As I mentioned, the countries are being hit again and again. So the communities are also being hit again and again before they can fully recover. So what once, like in a generation of flood or cyclone, now it occurring more frequent, and in some countries every season. For example, a farmer in Malaysia or in Sri Lanka, they have been hit by flood, for example, in September, and then they're being hit again by flood in October. So what it does is that it makes the displacement is not a one-off event, but it's a recurring, and this make the community harder to cope on this matter.
Right.
That's the second one. The third one, displacement is actually lasting longer. Many families, they cannot return because their houses are destroyed or because of their farmland is waterlogged, and maybe their livelihood have also been unstable. So in Bangladesh, what we have observed is that these repeated cyclones and storm surges, it destroyed paddy fields, it contaminated fish in the ponds. So of that, imagine the farmer, entire harvest have been destroyed, and the fishermen also lose their boat's equipment.
Right.
So because of this, they cannot simply recover within weeks if you have lost all of this, right? So it also led to a maybe permanent loss of income, making it extremely difficult to recover and to rebuild.
Wow, that's very worrying to see these three kind of compounding effects of a changing climate. Anissa, talk to me about the work that IFRC does. So if the scale of disaster is getting bigger, getting worse, it's becoming more frequent, and longer displacement is taking place, how then does organizations like yours support those people who are displaced? What is it that they need, as you said, before, during, and after? Walk me through maybe some of the work some of the support that they need.
So our Red Cross and Red Crescent National Societies, have I mentioned, we implemented and we have extensive activities during the full cycle of disaster, meaning we work before, during, and after disaster. But what is really important and what we really want to prioritize and what we really want to highlight is really preparedness, meaning we help helping communities stay safe before the disasters happen. So across Asia Pacific, there are activities that we done. For example, one of the most effective approaches is actually acting early when we know that, for example, the storm or flood is coming. So when the forecast shows that heavy rain or strong winds are likely, what we do is that our volunteers, our Red Cross and Red Crescent team, they do have plans. They will go to local communities. They will provide warnings to them, sending early warnings to SMS, to local radio station, different channels, and they can also go communities to communities providing this information. So this early warning really helps. And this means also that people are not waiting until the disaster hits. They can prepare, they can move to safety and protect what they value the most. That's the early action and early warning. Other than that, what we also have done is that we make sure that the essential items are placed in nearby areas where we know that the disaster going to hit.
Right.
So it means that we store items like blanket, mats, tarpaulin, clean water bottles in our storehouses, in our warehouses, in our Red Cross and Red Crescent branches that are spread all across the in the country. So before the rainy or cyclone season begin, so when the floods hits, so the help doesn't need to travel from far across away. So it's already nearby because we have the pre-positioning stock. And
Right.
these save hours or even days. And actually, these early hours are the most critical for keeping people safe and comfortable.
Absolutely. Anissa, can I come back to one of the findings from the report about longer displacement? I'm really curious about that because sometimes we think about displacement as temporary. We think, oh, once the flood waters recede, people can go home to their homes. But that's often not the case. Can you talk to me a little bit about how sometimes vulnerabilities can be compounded through disasters like severe floodings?
Yes, when we talk about displacement, when we talk about climate change, what we really need to be aware of, and we really need to, and what I really need to highlight is that climate change is not a standalone causes of people being displaced, whether it's temporarily or permanent. So what happened is that climate change is basically when it interacts with the pre-existing vulnerabilities, such as when people are poor, when you have a weak infrastructure of the houses, when you don't even have a really stable livelihood or income, what it does is that this climate change, it basically amplifies and deepens the pre-existing vulnerabilities. And this is the reason why some displacement can be temporary or some displacement can be a longer term, because if the area or if the context of the country already have conflict, already have economic crisis, climate change will amplify and deepens, and this can really react and the consequences can be far more longer for the affected population.
Right. So what message do you have for our audience today for in terms of preparedness, as you mentioned a bit earlier, but also in supporting the many people, our fellow countrymen and even our country neighbors in facing some of these displacement risks and extreme weather events?
Mm-hmm. What I really want to really stress out is that we not always frame climate-related displacement as a climate displacement. We always think, as you mentioned, this is temporary evacuation. But even though we say that it's a temporary, what we need to understand, as I mentioned earlier, for example, in my home state of Perak, we in Larut, Matang, and Selama, what we have observed that they have flood in September and they have flood again coming to November to December. So what we have is the repeated nature of displacement. And this what makes it severe. So even though it's temporary, it makes it severe because people don't have less time to recover, less time to restore income, and less time to also prepare emotionally and financially. And because of this, the emotional cost and financial accumulates. And this put pressure. So when families are able to return home, they may not recover fully. So they're able to return home, yes, but they may not recover fully. So we have to really realize about this fact that even though it's temporary, it now is becoming repeated, and the consequences are severe as well. Whether it's a temporary or a longer term, so we need to acknowledge this fact. We need to be more prepared, and for IFRC, we call for a stronger financial for the early action, the preparedness, and support from the government and other relevant stakeholders.
Right. Anissa, thank you so much for speaking with me. Anissa M. Ismail there from IFRC, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.